Hey everybody, Jason Bermas here, and what you're about to watch is the full Roger Stone interview that was part of the RVM exclusive content that we're now doing on a Monday through Thursday basis. The morning show is live from 8 to 10 a.m., and although you can listen to the whole thing for free on Podbean in real time, and it's archived there right now, if you want the video, which I think is an important aspect of it, let's be honest, we go over a lot of documentation and articles here. You want the video, it's $10 a month. But let's say you enjoy this interview and you want to see what the rest of the premium broadcast was like. It's now free also. You go over to redvoicemedia.com, you see that second hour. So every 2 weeks, we're also releasing it for free because we want this information out there. We want you to share it. So without further ado, here is the full Roger Stone interview from a couple weeks back where we discuss Julian Assange, we discuss the midterm elections, and we even discuss JFK, which I think is really the most interesting part. Hey everybody, Jason Bermas here, and we've got a spicy segment for you today. On the heels of Trump making it official, we have one of the most infamous characters of the 20th century, in my opinion, with us to discuss everything Trump, the 2022 midterms, 2024 coming up. We have Roger Stone. Roger, thank you so much for joining us.
Delighted to be with you, Jason.
Now, Roger, we've met a couple times now on the Reawaken America tour. You preceded my last speech out there. You're heavily involved in what I would call is really a tour that was prepping for this very moment, pushing Donald Trump when a lot of people were not as behind him as they have been in the past. What do you think the impact of that tour, and apparently there's going to be several more after, is going to be after this announcement has come full circle? We know that both Eric and Don Jr. have spoken there, yourself and many others.
Well, I think the Reawaken America tour is absolutely vital. I think that during the Trump presidency, even to a certain extent during the 2022 election, there are those who rallied to Trump not because they really believe in him, not because they really support his policies, but because he is so extraordinarily popular with the grassroots of the Republican Party, which is where most of our voters are. Now what you see in the reemergence Trump is Trump circa 2015, 2016. The outsider, the anti-establishment candidate, the guy who doesn't really care about whether he has any endorsements for congressmen, as if that gets you anything. You see the true Trump and the true Trump movement. Those are not the people at the Republican state conventions. Those are the people who are at the Reawaken America tour. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, when we went to Media, Pennsylvania, I believe it was, outside of Lancaster, there were 5,000 citizens there. I stood for almost an hour shaking hands, signing Trump hats, posing for selfies. And it was notable. I didn't see any country club Republicans. I didn't see any rich people. I didn't see any corporate fat cats. What I saw were average, hardworking Christian Americans who still believe in the American dream. These are the people that will propel an improbable Trump candidacy forward. These are the people, and Trump made this clear last night, this is not his campaign, this is our campaign. So we're basically reinventing the energy and the magic of 2015, 2016, and I think against very long and difficult odds, and against a nearly monolithic corporate-owned legacy media. Once again, I think we will be victorious.
You know, I'm glad you made several points there. The legacy media, for instance, has tried to, I believe, gaslight the public into thinking that somehow Trump is not as popular as he once was. And look, I'm no cheerleader for the guy. I'm skeptical on this whole thing for 2024, but there is no doubt he is incredibly popular. And I would also say that Kari Lake was incredibly popular on the heels of 2022 and the midterms and the results of these midterms with not only voting machines, but many of the rules that were put into place via the COVID-19 84 nightmare and then continued, really codified. How do we have free and fair elections? Obviously, you and I both feel like Trump was cheated in 2020 with little to no recourse. So, first of all, what do you think about 2022, the midterms, Kerry Lake and others, Blake Masters among them? And how do we change the system so that we don't have these outcomes coming up in now less than 2 years?
Well, you've asked the single most difficult question. I mean, we can argue amongst ourselves about who our nominee should be. I'm for Donald Trump. Others may choose to try to prop up some other candidate. That's fine. It's still a free country, at least for a little bit longer. But does it matter who our nominee is if the elections are rigged from the outset? It's just very hard for me to understand how France can have an election with 34.5 million people, all paper ballots, and by 7 o'clock at night, it's all counted, and there are no disputes. Yet a little state like Arizona, which is a fraction of the size of Texas, or Florida for that matter, is still trying to sort out the results a solid week after the election. I think it's interesting, last night in his remarks, because I was in the room, if you look at Twitter, you can see in that particular cesspool of hatred and invective, a lot of people noticed that I was there. The single biggest response he got from the audience was when he talked about a very simple remedy for our current election machinery. The election should take place on one day. The election should be conducted with paper ballots. There should be no drop boxes. There should be no machines. There should be no mail-in voting, and election day should be a national holiday. So nobody can argue that they're being disenfranchised. They can do this in third world countries as well as major European countries, but we seem incapable of it. But that's by design. If you ask me what I thought of the midterms, I blame the Republican leadership more than I do Donald Trump. Trump's candidate in Ohio, J.D. Vance, won a relatively easy victory in that race. That's a pickup, but you won't see the mainstream media talking about that. Senator Ron Johnson, who's probably the number one defender of Donald Trump in the U.S. Senate, every other Republican in Wisconsin goes down in flames. Ron Johnson is successful. You won't see that. Mitch McConnell shifts $9 million away from Blake Masters in Arizona to Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, who is not even a Republican. She was elected as an independent who chose to organize with the Republican caucus, but nobody points that out. So this idea that the party fell short and it's Trump's fault, no, the party fell short. The red wave became a pink drizzle, but that's not Donald Trump's fault. That is the fault of Kevin McCarthy, Ronna McDaniel, and Mitch McConnell. Everybody's ready to get rid of the mix here. That's not an anti-Irish statement, by the way.
Well, let's look at that, because I would argue it's really the infrastructure that is robbing these people in these elections, and that's, again, what we have to address. But let's look at the first Trump administration. You talked about Ron Johnson. I think that Ron Johnson is one of the more solid Republicans. There's not many of them. Rand Paul would be amongst them. Thomas Massie would be amongst them. DeSantis, I guess, would be amongst them, but now you also have this media narrative where they are trying to pit DeSantis against Trump. What would you like to see in means of his administration, especially the vice presidential pick, as Mike Pence was all over Fox News yesterday, basically carrying this media narrative that there are those not only in the Republican Party, Roger, but in mainline Republican and conservative circles that want, quote unquote, new leadership?
Well, first of all, I would have to challenge some of the premise of your question regarding Ron DeSantis. My governor voted for TPP in the Congress, for example. He's been very, very good in the second year of his first term. I'm not sure where he was in the first 2 years. He's been excellent in terms of the cancel culture. He's been excellent in terms of challenging the education establishment that's trying to indoctrinate our children with race, gender, and sex lies. And I applaud him. I voted for him. Everyone in my family voted for him. But he is a Yale Harvard graduate. He seems to now be the choice of a number of major globalists. Look, when Paul Ryan is saying good things about you, when Bill Maher is saying good things about you, when Meghan McCain and Jeb Bush are lauding you, that gives me very real pause. Is Donald Trump perfect? No, not at all. Did he make major mistakes in his first 4 years? Absolutely. But given the implacable opposition of the two-party duopoly that was out to stymie his presidency to begin with, what he did accomplish is really quite extraordinary. And I really believe, having talked to him about this at some length, that he learned a great deal. You see, he had the quaint idea that we were going to follow the great tradition of American politics in which the loser graciously concedes and supports the country and supports the institution of the presidency. He had no idea that Barack Obama, who welcomed him so warmly to the White House, was already moving the levers of government to remove him, utilizing completely fabricated information. And recently we learned, and he mentioned this last night, the FBI offered $1 million for dirt that they could use to remove Donald Trump. And they paid a guy $200,000 as an informant, essentially to ensure that he would never have to testify about his illicit activities. That's a crime and a scandal, and yes, a dirty trick far bigger than Watergate. Watergate was at least a private operation in which a small group of misguided individuals broke into the Democratic National Committee. There was never any evidence that President Richard Nixon knew about it or approved it, and the bugs they placed never actually worked. But we're told it was the greatest constitutional crisis in our history. Here you have Barack Obama and Joe Biden, who's in the room, knowingly harnessing the full authority of the federal government and the extraordinary capabilities and cash reserve of the intelligence agencies to mount, based on what they know is falsified information, a full-fledged coup to remove a sitting president. And to this day, nobody has been punished for that. Nobody's even been prosecuted. John Durham essentially charged the guy who was driving the getaway car for double parking while he let the bank robbers get away. It's really quite extraordinary.
Well, I would agree with you that that was kind of a farce, and especially the legal ways they went after Donald Trump during his presidency were insanely absurd. It started with Russia, and really an establishment face via Mueller and the Mueller report. And then it moved into the Ukrainian impeachment. And I still say to this day, if you had told me when I first started covering the fact that Joe Biden was up on stage with the head of the CFR, Richard Haass, bragging about basically extorting the leader of the Ukraine for $1 billion if he did not get rid of the prosecutor who was investigating his son, I would have laughed at you. I would have said that is an impossibility. Fast forward to Trump daring to ask that person to open an investigation, and we have impeachment too. And we have impeachment too on the heels of the fact that the Justice Department has the Hunter Biden laptop. So that brings me to my next question, although I'd still love to get some ideas on who should be in the cabinet, Roger. What do you do when a system is criminally going after this guy? And have we set up with this new DOJ investigation something where 12 months, 18 months down the line, they do criminally charge Donald Trump and essentially make it impossible for him to run in 2024?
Well, first of all, were they to charge Donald Trump, we don't know that they will, but were they to do so, first thing that would do is turbocharge his campaign. That would be the worst day, for example, Ron DeSantis could possibly imagine, because I think the American people will rally to the president's side, correctly seeing any action against him as politically motivated. Secondarily, it doesn't legally prevent him from running for office, and in fact provides a rationale for his candidacy. Folks, these charges against me are all politically motivated. think most people would see that. The Ukrainian impeachment is, in fact, an aggressive effort to cover up their illegal actions vis-a-vis Ukraine. So it is a defensive measure rather than an offensive measure. The real question is, will the new House majority, if it is under Kevin McCarthy, and we still don't know that, people I think are a little confused. The caucus vote does not select the speaker, only a vote of the full House. And in that vote, Kevin McCarthy will need at least 218 Republicans to become speaker. Now, Congressman Matt Gaetz says that he has the enough votes to deny the speakership to McCarthy, presumably not because he's for another candidate, but because he wants certain concessions from McCarthy about the House agenda. Is there going to be a vigorous investigation into Hunter Biden? Is there going to be a real January 6th investigation that looks at all aspects of what happened that day? Are we even going to look at these incredible abuses by the FBI and the Central Intelligence Agency? So I think Gaetz is on the right path. Whether or not he has the votes that he claims to have at this point remains to be seen. As far as the Trump cabinet, I don't know. Secretary of State Rand Paul sounds awful good to me. FBI Director Bill Barr, not Bob Barr, Bill Barr, or Attorney General Bob Barr, the former U.S. attorney, former congressman from Georgia, would be an excellent appointment. And that's just off the top of my head.
Well, I would say there's a few other people in there. Again, Rand Paul is a name that I like both for Secretary of State or possibly Vice President. I think that's a good move. But, we talk about these criminal investigations, and I want to shift gears a little bit to the fact that they're using basically the Espionage Act against Trump. And I know that sometimes you're hesitant to talk about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, but through the Trump administration, they continued this persecution and prosecution of Assange, although there was some kind of a deal to be cut with Rohrabacher that seemed to fall through. Do you see an irony that they used that same thing against Trump, who failed to pardon Julian Assange? And what is your assessment if we do actually extradite Julian Assange to this country via this Espionage Act and his work at WikiLeaks?
First of all, I think Julian Assange is a journalist. The claim that he's a Russian asset is, at best, unproven. There is no evidence of that. Let me remind you that the person who insisted that Julian Assange was a foreign state actor was Mike Pompeo. That's right, the CIA director under Donald Trump, the guy who would like to be president, not a MAGA Republican at all. I have written extensively at some cost to myself in defense of Assange, because I believe it's a slippery slope. If you start prosecuting journalists, who's next? Notice the crimes under which he is prosecuted have nothing to do with his reporting or his disclosures, which is kind of interesting. That's a sign to the rest of the media that you don't have to worry about you being prosecuted next. But make no mistake about it. I was advocating a pardon for Assange. I was accused of collaborating with him. There is no evidence of that. That was not proven at my trial because it's not true. It's a fake news fugazi is what that is. It's a fraud. But it is very concerning, his treatment. And we both know that there's zero chance that the Biden administration is going to pardon him. Here's the part that's funny. The left wing loved Julian Assange when he was embarrassing the Bush administration. They thought he was terrific. It was only until he started exposing the crimes of the Clintons and the Clinton war machine that they decided that he must be a Russian asset, which he's denied, and which, again, we have no evidence of. We just have the word of our intelligence agencies.
I absolutely agree with you there. And I was wondering if I maybe could get your take then on the FBI and their recent announcement that they're looking for 66 years before they disclose what's in the quote-unquote Seth Rich laptop. And this is an FBI that first said they had no data on Rich. Rich is then brought up in the Mueller report, and in that part of the report where there are some redactions. They make the claim that Julian Assange basically put out disinformation via Seth Rich, making it look like he may have been the quote-unquote DNC leaker to thwart the fact that he was this Russian agent or Russian asset, yet they never proved any ties with Russia, with either Assange or the Trump administration, Roger.
Well, at my trial, my defense lawyers asked for the famous CrowdStrikes report, and the judge denied it to us at defense. Now we know why. Sean Henry, the head of CrowdStrikes, the IT company that was brought in by the Democratic National Committee to inspect their computer servers, and it became public and was confirmed in my trial that the FBI never asked to see the servers and never examined the servers. Henry testified under oath before the House Intelligence Committee, testimony that was classified at the time of my trial, that no, the CrowdStrikes report did not contain proof of an online hack of the DNC by the Russians or anyone else for that matter. And I wanted to use expert testimony and forensic evidence to demonstrate that the material stolen from the DNC had been downloaded based on download speeds to some kind of portable drive and taken out the back door by someone. The judge denied us the ability to produce any of those witnesses or to enter any of that evidence. So again, much like the Steele report, the narrative has been shaped by completely falsified information. There is no evidence that Seth Rich was a Russian asset or that he was leaking to Assange. That's bass-ackward, as they would say. But it is now to a point where even discussing Seth Rich's name will subject you, to threats of lawsuits. So his parents go from insisting that his watch, his money, his credit cards, his jewelry was all intact, and therefore this could not have been a robbery, to now saying, oh, it was a robbery and stop asking us questions because you're invading our family's privacy. But they started saying that as soon as they got a crisis manager working for them who worked previously for the Democratic National Committee. We still don't know the truth of any of this.
Well, I'll say this points to a systemic issue within not only our Federal Bureau of Investigations, but you just mentioned Mike Pompeo, I would argue the Central Intelligence Agency, and what many refer to as the quote-unquote swamp or deep state. So I guess the question now would be, you had Trump come out when he was the president and promised all of us that we were going to get the JFK documents. He failed on that twice. Recently, Joe Biden also punted that football. My question would be is if you can't reveal those documents and take on the deep state from 50 plus years ago, how much success will you have in modern times? Because I think that these historical events, when they expose that type of corruption, are extremely connected and necessary to show people how bad and corrupt the system really is.
Well, as you probably know, I wrote a New York Times best-selling book called The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. I'll be talking about it very extensively on the upcoming anniversary of John F. Kennedy's murder. Just to be technically correct, Donald Trump actually released about 80% of the previously restricted documents regarding the Kennedy assassination. For reasons that I don't really fully understand, he held back 20% of the documents. At the time, we know that the intelligence agencies were claiming that release of those documents would expose their sources and methods. That's absurd because there's nobody still working for the government who was in a position of authority in 1963. Secondarily, if they're covering up the murder of an American president, we need to know what their sources are. When I asked the president directly what was there, he said, I can't discuss it. You wouldn't believe it. It's so horrible. Someday you'll find out. That's kind of an incongruous answer. And then, of course, as you correctly point out, the presidential records, I should say, the JFK Assassination Records Act, called yet again for release in the current year, and Joe Biden kicked the can down the road yet again. Only the president has the authority to delay the full release of these documents. That said, in the previous data dump, we learned an extraordinary number of things. We learned, for example, that the reason that the IRS and the government never released Lee Harvey Oswald's tax records is because it would have showed a W-9 and a 1099 form from the FBI for whom he had worked as an informant. We learned that he attended the foreign language school run by essentially the CIA out of North Carolina. So we learned a lot of very valuable things, but we still do not have the full picture.
Well, let me say this. When the initial dump was allowed by Trump, I did go through those documents, and you discussed Oswald's relationship with the FBI, and his handler was a man named Warren C. DeBrew, and there was actually an extensive amount of documents that had not been released previously on that individual, so there was some value there. But again, I think that no matter how ugly and brutal it is, we deserve to know as the American public, and without knowing, we still have a system of obfuscation, and with that obfuscation comes these great narratives. On CNN last night, for instance, Anderson Cooper had Mick Mulvaney on, and Mulvaney made this statement about Trump. He feels like Donald Trump is the only person that can lose the 2024 election. And let's break that down for a second, because here we have Joe Biden, who's supposed to be the most popular president of all time, 81 million votes. But even Anderson Cooper is letting someone acknowledge he's that bad that literally anybody could beat Joe Biden in a fair race. But because of the disdain of the establishment and the mainstream media, it feels like they would fortify another election against Trump. What's your take on that?
Well, a couple things. First of all, did Anderson Cooper start his questioning by saying, Mr. Mulvaney, you were fired by Donald Trump and disgraced in that firing? Is that correct? I bet he didn't start with that question, did he?
Instead, he started with every other narrative you can imagine about Trump and his corruption, obviously, because, again, that's where they're trying to push it. But does Mulvaney actually have kind of a sick point in that they would let somebody who was more establishment? You know, you discussed DeSantis, as good as his record is in the last several years, you see billionaires getting behind him. I don't trust these people, and I don't think the vast majority of Americans do, but that doesn't mean that they won't put these plans into action, Roger.
I actually think, sadly, they would vilify anyone who is the nominee of the Republican Party. And the things that Ron DeSantis would have to commit himself to in order to successfully wrestle the nomination from Donald Trump will also identify him as a danger to the status quo of the deep state. Whether he intends to keep those intentions or not is a risk they probably wouldn't take. So it still leads us all back to the central question, which is, what can we do over the next 2 years to ensure that the next elections are not manipulated, as the elections we have just seen very clearly were? For those of you who watched me on frankspeech.com, I have a daily show there, Stone Zone, stonezone.live. You can see it 5 o'clock every day Eastern time, stonezone.live. You could actually see, thanks to money spent by Mike Lindell, in real time, these massive ballot dumps in the middle of the night. Anytime the race began to become close, or at any time where the Republican threatened to pass the Democrat in terms of the totals, out of nowhere you would have the dumping of 98,000 ballots here, 100,000 ballots there. This is not conjecture. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not somebody's idea of what may have happened. You can actually see it in real time. We can't have that, or it won't matter who we nominate for any office if we can't have free, fair, honest elections. I would argue that Donald Trump is uniquely positioned to highlight that issue. He also, I think, has another arrow in his sling last night, which in my opinion was greatly underutilized in this election cycle, in the 2016 election, in the 2020 election. We need term limits for members of Congress. It's arguable how long. Maybe it's 3 terms and you're out, 2 terms in the Senate and you're out. But this is an idea that is enormously popular with the voters across the board. But the body politic and the political establishment in both parties resists this idea. So it got mentioned once in the 2016 campaign. It got mentioned a couple times in 2020. It needs to become a battle cry. It needs to become an overarching theme of Donald Trump's next campaign.
Well, I would argue that also you have to reform what lobbyists can do, and I'd like to take money out of politics. Now, I know you kind of were at the antithesis of the beginning of that and how lobbying was changed, and one day I'd love to have a long-form conversation with you. But respecting your time, I got one more question for you. Michael Flynn, also on the Reawaken America tour. Is there any chance that there's somewhere in this second Trump administration for Flynn, or is he going to kind of remain on the peripheral with events like these?
Well, first of all, I agree with the Supreme Court when they ruled that money is free speech. And yeah, I had a very brief career as a lobbyist, but I've never been in any federal office. I've never held public office or worked for the government. By the way, I wasn't very good at it. I'm interested in politics, not government. General Michael Flynn is one of the greatest men I've ever met. And that's saying a lot because I've worked for multiple presidents, elected multiple governors. I've known a large number of U.S. senators. He is truly one of the greatest patriots that I've ever met. No, he is not a Christian nationalist, if you mean that in a negative way. He is a devout Roman Catholic. No, he's most certainly not a white supremacist. I'm so sick of this ridiculous, baseless name calling. He is a selfless patriot who is in the same crosshairs as I was, a victim. We now know definitively that the entire case against him was a fraud. And I would hope that he has an important role to play in the country's future. I've said at virtually every Reawaken American tour, something I deeply believe. Mike Flynn's greatest days of public service lie ahead.
Well, we'll wrap it there. StoneZone.com is the website. Roger Stone, thank you so much for the time. We really appreciate it, and I hope to have you back.
God bless you, and Godspeed.
And once again, that was part of the premium broadcast over at Red Voice Media that is now available for free. Check out the whole broadcast over at their website. And remember, you can support me via the links down below via Rockfin or PayPal or so many other ways of just sharing the documentary films. Because remember, guys, it's not about left or right. It's always about right and wrong.